Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's 9th annual Focus on Fellows. This is our 4th program we've hosted this year, and we say thank you to all of you who attended our last program on August 27th. My name is Sara Cromer, and I'll be moderating today's program. Just a little bit about myself. I am a Focus on Fellows graduate and also a junior faculty member in the Division of Endocrinology at Massachusetts General Hospital. I focus on both clinical work and research, with my research focusing mainly on disparities in the care of patients with type 2 diabetes. And none of this would be possible without the guidance of the ADA's Early Career Advisory Group. So we would like to thank the members for all of their hard work to develop today's program. We also are very grateful for the support of the Leona M and Harry B. Helmsley Charitable Trust, who have made this meeting a possibility. Now let's see who we have with us today. If you are a fellow on the call, we would love to know a little bit more about you. And if you wouldn't mind, please post your organization and the state that you're joining from in the chat. Wonderful. University of Texas Southwestern in Dallas. Wonderful. Thank you for joining. Great. All right. Now, thank you everyone for joining. As a Focus on Fellows participant, you also become a member of the American Diabetes Association, and this free ADA membership provides even more opportunities to network and grow professionally. ADA membership includes a variety of what we call professional member benefits, and these include discounts on our annual meetings, access to WIN ADA or the Women's Interprofessional Network, access to join other interest groups, like, for example, I'm in the Public Health and Epidemiology interest group, access to the Diabetes Pro Member Forum, access to professional journals like Diabetes and Diabetes Care, members-only webinars, the member directory, the standards of medical care in diabetes, and the Diabetes Pro Quarterly. As you can see, as a member, you'll have access to all of these great resources as a professional member, and you'll receive more information about membership in the ADA following today's session. Another great resource is the ADA Primary Care Certificate Bundle. It is designed to help clinicians on the front lines of primary care master the latest ADA standards of medical care and diabetes and to competently apply strategies for overcoming therapeutic inertia. It includes 2 popular certificate programs, the Diabetes is Primary program and the Overcoming Therapeutic Inertia program, and these can provide up to 22 continuing education credits. You can also register for either the Diabetes is Primary program or the Overcoming Therapeutic Inertia program separately, or you can build your own educational experience by choosing individual modules to register for. If you're interested in learning more or registering for these programs, you can use the link on the bottom of this slide and in the chat. And with that, we'll now be transitioning to talk about today's agenda. We'll spend today's program by following the agenda listed on the screen. And please note that today's presentation and workshops will include a question and answer session. If you have questions as we move through the presentation, if you would please put them in the Q&A box in your control panel, we would appreciate it. And if you'd like to ask a question live, which we strongly encourage, you can let us know in the chat, or you can press the raise hand button, which is located in the reactions tool on your dashboard. It could also be listed under more or under options. And we'll be answering as many questions as we can, both throughout the presentation and at the end of the presentation. I now have the privilege of introducing our speaker today, Mr. Alan Debag. Mr. Debag is an experienced career coach and learning consultant with over 20 years of experience. As a career coach, he has experience in a variety of environments, and Alan has helped clients gain clarity about their career pathways and how to pursue them. His training practice has focused on the areas of communication skills, management and leadership development, and career development. Alan has developed and facilitated training in management skills, presentation skills, meeting facilitation skills, and business writing skills. His clients include associations, corporations, federal government agencies, and healthcare organizations. Alan possesses a liberal arts undergraduate degree from the State University of New York College at Geneseo, a master's degree in human resources development from Rochester Institute of Technology, and a graduate certificate in industrial labor relations from Cornell. Thank you, Mr. Debag, for joining us today, and I'll now turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Cromer, and welcome, everybody. So welcome to Working Smart in a Virtual Environment. And I'm really excited to be here with you this afternoon because this is something we all have really had to learn more about and get used to over the past 18 months or so. And I should tell you, first of all, I have worked from a home office for about the past 20 years. And before COVID, went out to see clients in person a good deal of the time, but also did some work virtually. But over the past 18 months, my work has become almost entirely virtual, both doing presentations and facilitating classes, as well as consulting with clients. And it's become something of a lot of interest to me, not only because of the experiences I've had, but because of the experiences that my clients have had. So I've started doing some research around this and identifying some of the issues that people are facing, and also have just learned an awful lot from the mistakes that I've made along the way. So I'm really excited to be here with you this afternoon and share some of the things I've learned along the way. Really want to make this interactive and get some input from you about some of the challenges you've faced and some of the strategies that you've used to be successful virtually. And at the end of our time together, I'm confident that we're going to have some ideas that will help all of us work together in virtual environments much more effectively. So to start things off, I'd like to share the objectives with you for this afternoon, and they look something like this. And we'll start off in just a couple of minutes talking a little bit about how working virtually is different. And I'm going to ask you to chime in. I have a few questions about this I want to share with you. I'm going to ask you to really chime in and share some of your thoughts in just a few minutes, because boy, I'm sure you have found, as I have, that working virtually is very, very different in a lot of ways. Related to that, I think we've all had to learn how to adjust mentally. And I find that I have to adjust mentally on a daily basis. So we'll talk a little bit about that and some of the strategies that I've used, some of the strategies that you all have used in making sure that you are adjusting and you're as effective as possible. And then there's some logistical issues like preparing and using your space. And you would not believe some of the things I have seen over the past 18 months in terms of the space that people have attempted to use. So we'll talk about some strategies around that. And my personal weak spot, which is understanding and using technology, because I am not a technology guy at all. And I've learned a lot of things the hard way around technology. So I have some ideas around that I want to share with you, and some ideas that will help you avoid some of the issues that I've faced over time. I think one of the biggest issues that people face working virtually is burnout. Boy, is it easy to burn out. So easy to just feel so stressed and so burnt out, and I don't want to do this for another day. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the signs of burnout, but then we'll talk about some strategies for managing burnout as well as trying to avoid burnout. And finally, a lot of my clients are actually starting to transition to a hybrid environment, meaning that they are continuing to work virtually part of the time, but they also are going back into their office environments part-time. And as easy as that sounds, a lot of us came from office environments. We were accustomed to an office environment. After a year or 18 months, making that transition and also working part of the time in an office environment and part of the time in a virtual environment, that's harder than it sounds. So we'll finish up today by talking a little bit about transitioning to that hybrid environment and what some strategies are around that. So those are the objectives that we'll be looking at over the next hour or so. And to get there, here is what our roadmap looks like. And it really mimics the objectives that I just shared with you. And so let's get right into it. And let's start off by talking a little bit about a virtual environment and working virtually and what that all means, how that's different. So I'd really like to get your input for the next few minutes, and I've got some questions that I'd like to get your input on. And the first question I have for you is this: based on what you've experienced, how is virtual work different? How is working in a virtual environment different than working in a traditional office environment or a traditional medical environment if you have traditionally worked in a medical environment. So I'd like you to go to the chat box if you could and share your thoughts. How is virtual work different? How is working in a virtual environment different? Really curious about what you think about that. I know one of the things that I've found, and I'll share one of the things I've found while you are typing your information into the chat box. I do a lot of training virtually these days versus being in a classroom. And people come to me and they say, oh, that must be so easy. You're sitting at home, you're just in front of your computer doing your training in your home environment. That must be so easy. It must be so relaxing. And one of the things that I have found is that it is absolutely exhausting. And I find at the end of the day that I am much, much more tired than I would be if I actually were standing in front of a group in a classroom. And so how is it different? It is actually, I think, more tiring than working in a face-to-face environment. And that certainly has been one of my experiences. So very curious about your thoughts. And we're getting some ideas in from some folks. Amanda says, oh, this is interesting. Amanda says, I can't touch the patient, so I have to trust their description of the symptoms. More time waiting and connectivity issues. Absolutely. You know, that's an interesting observation. I recently had poison ivy. And I could not get to my physician in person. And so I did a telemedicine appointment. And I think it was very interesting for the physician who was working with me because I was literally holding my arm up to the camera and she was trying to look and diagnose whether or not it was poison ivy. And that's very different than being in the same room. So I think that's a really pertinent observation, Amanda. Teresa says distractions in the background, and we're going to talk more about that because I think a lot of us have dealt with that. Jen not being able to physically assess the patient as easily, so similar to what Amanda talked about. And Amanda, I love this. Hard to sometimes never leave your home and talk to others aside from family. I have found, especially when COVID was at its worst, I did not leave the house for days at a time. And there's a certain amount of stress around that. And boy, is that different. So agree with that completely. And Molly, we are going to talk about this this afternoon as well. Molly says it's harder to end the day to stop working, and it's easy to let work extend into the evenings. And I actually have some research around that I'm going to share with you in just a moment, because I agree with that completely. So very interesting. So this is kind of related, but I'm curious about what some of the challenges are that you have faced in working virtually. And so once again, if you could go to the chat box and just share with us, what are some of the challenges that you have faced in working virtually? And while you're typing, again, I'll share one of my biggest challenges. And one of my biggest challenges has been as a facilitator, as a training or a learning facilitator, assessing how engaged people are. Because you're looking, I call this the postage stamp. You're looking at this little postage stamp of me, and you're looking at my slides, and occasionally I'm able to see people. I can see their screens, but boy, it's awfully hard to tell how engaged people are as a learning facilitator. If I'm in the room with people, I can see if they're starting to doze off. I can tell, and I can do something about it. But if you're at home and you decide, oh, I'm bored with this, I'm going to feed my dog or do my email or whatever, really, really hard for me to see that. So that's a huge challenge for me, making sure that people are engaged. So I am curious about what some of your challenges are. And oh, Jen, I am with you. She says technology. Yes, yes, yes. Connectivity issues. Cameras not working. Patients unable to understand how to turn the camera on or off or the audio. And I bet that is a challenge, especially with some of your more elderly patients who have not used a lot of technology in the past. And so you end up doing a lot of phone patient visits because of this. Makes sense. Teresa says we can't give the person some of the books that we would usually give out in person. And that must be an interesting challenge, because I would imagine in working with your patients, there's just a certain connection you get with them just by saying, here, this, I'd like you to read this book, or this book has information that'll be really helpful to you, and being able to personally, physically hand them that book. That's got to be really interesting. Big challenge. So a couple of real good challenges there. Again, a lot about interaction with patients and about technology. And finally, what concerns do you have about continuing to work virtually, if you are going to be continuing to work more virtually, if you are going to be going back to more of an in-person environment? What concerns do you have moving forward? And I'll share one of my top concerns with you. One of my top concerns is that I'm going to have become so accustomed to working virtually that I'm going to find it challenging to actually be back in a room with people. And I actually have just started to do some in-person facilitation again. And it felt strange when I actually got into a room with people. And so I've had some concerns about what that transition is going to be like, moving from doing my work virtually to actually being in a room with people again. And for those of you who are doing a lot of telemedicine and are potentially going to be going back into office environment and seeing people in person again, that probably is a very, very different experience, and it's going to be different. So interested in any ideas around any concerns that any of you have? And I don't see any yet. It's kind of related to what we've already talked about. So if you do have any, please type them in, and I will I'll keep looking for them and let you know when I see them. But let's go ahead and get into some of our content. And as I mentioned to you, I've been spending a fair amount of time doing some research around this and how virtual work is affecting people, both emotionally and physically. A lot of people have gained weight from working virtually. And so I've been doing a lot of research into this, and I want to share with you some information from an absolutely fascinating article that was recently in the Wall Street Journal. The article was called, and this is in the way, The Value of Liberty for Workers. So it kind of looked at virtual work as giving people more liberty in the workplace than they are accustomed to having. And if you want to access it, it was in the weekend edition of the Wall Street Journal back on October 9th and 10th. And it really shared some interesting ideas around the impacts of virtual work and the impact that virtual work has on us. And some of these made a lot of sense to me, and some of them really kind of surprised me. So I wanted to share some of the primary impacts that the article talked about. One thing that it mentioned was that a lot of people who are working virtually have less time to focus. And I thought that was kind of interesting, because I would have thought it might have been the opposite, that people who are working virtually might have more time to focus because there are not all of the interruptions that there would normally be if you are in an in-person workplace. But the barriers kind of go down when you're working remotely, and your patients, your supervisor, your colleagues just figure, well, if you are online, everything is fair game. And so a lot of people feel that they have less time to focus, they have more interruptions, and that really makes them less productive. And I thought that was really kind of an interesting observation. So blocking out that time is one effective strategy that a lot of people have used in order to have that time to focus and be more productive. A couple of you have already mentioned this as we've been talking about challenges and how virtual work is different. And that is about it being more stressful because a lot of us are working in our homes. And that is a very, very different experience for a lot of us. And in the article, the journal talked about segmenters and integrators. And I thought this was an interesting distinction. Segmenters are people who like to have those guardrails up. They like to have separation between their work life and their home life. And that separation is really, really important for them. Integrators are people to whom that's less important, and their home life and their work life are really more connected and more integrated. And probably comes as no surprise that virtual work has been much more stressful for people who are segmenters, because it's much harder for them to have those guardrails and to separate home life from their professional life. And so that's been a big stressor for people who are segmenters. And another thing that really surprised me, but when you think about it, it does make sense. There's research actually that was quoted in this article that says voice-only conversations can be less exhausting and more effective than video conversations. And I thought about that for a while and looked at the research. And I thought, well, how can that be? Isn't it a more effective conversation if I can see you and you can see me and we have that connection by video? But if you think about it, anytime that you're going to be on video, I had to work on my background today to make sure my background was appropriate. I'm trying to concentrate on the camera so that I have a connection with you. There are all kinds of things around the video that you're working on and trying to concentrate on that tend to get in the way of the conversation. And so the idea is that a voice-only conversation, all the video stuff is gone, and you really are just concentrating on that conversation and the content of that conversation. And so for a lot of people, it's less exhausting. And a lot of people have found voice-only conversations to be more effective. So hadn't really thought about that. I think that's really, really interesting and makes a good point, a good argument for actually using the phone occasionally. So that was interesting. And then I think the last thing is no surprise, less face time equals less opportunity for promotion. If we're not actually in the workplace, whatever our workplace may be, certainly there's less opportunity to observe our performance. Our boss, senior executives have less chance to see us. And so it really could impact opportunities for promotion. I don't think there's any surprise there at all. But this really sets the scene very nicely for our conversation today, because this really does bring out some kind of surprising impacts around virtual work. So wanted to share that with you to kind of set the scene. And let's now transition into talking about how mentally you can get yourself into the right place in order to work virtually. So I've got another question for you, and I'd love to get your feedback on this. And that question is, how do I prepare myself mentally to be effective in that virtual workplace? And it could be big picture. What have I done overall to prepare myself mentally to be more productive? It could be on a daily basis. What do I do to prepare myself mentally to be effective when I actually get on the computer and start working virtually for the day? So I'm curious about what your thoughts are. How do you prepare yourself mentally? What's your self-talk is another way of putting it around preparing yourself to work effectively virtually. So once again, if you could go to the chat box and share some ideas with us about that. How do you prepare yourself mentally? And I will share one thing that I do that I think is really important. I do establish some mental guardrails for myself, because I don't want to have a lot of distractions, and mentally I want to be as focused as I possibly can. And so it's so easy when you're working at home, it's so easy to think about, well, I could get some laundry done and the refrigerator's down there calling my name, and wouldn't it be wonderful to have a snack, and all kinds of things. And so mentally, I actually, when I started doing 18 months ago, when I started working virtually on pretty much a full-time basis, I actually set up some rules for myself so that I would be prepared mentally and I would be able to better focus. and kind of establish those guardrails mentally for myself. So I am curious about what you all do to prepare yourselves mentally. Would love to get your input. I'm not seeing anything in the chat box yet, so please, here we go. All of a sudden, I guess they were out there in cyberspace. So what have we got? So Jen says, close the room door, reduce distractions, turn phone on silent. That's a real important one. Have a timer for lunchtime. And that's really important. Another thing I do mentally is I do take a break every hour. I try to take a 5 or 10 minute break every hour because that just really helps me be more tuned in and more attentive. Amanda says, hates virtual visits, but do some from the physical clinic. Between in-person patients, I check in with the RN who starts the visit to make sure I've reviewed the chart. Good. So you kind of just get yourself prepared before you actually speak with the patient, prepared mentally. And Teresa, prepare slides, handouts, so you have them ready for your visit, then you're ready mentally. That's really a good idea, Teresa, because if you have all of the collateral that you need, all of the stuff that you need, that really does help you be better prepared mentally. I can tell you as a trainer, one of the things I do when I'm facilitating or training is that I actually, especially if I'm doing it virtually, I actually put the slides up and I actually walk through what I'm going to be doing. And I actually rehearse out loud so that I am prepared mentally when I actually get into the virtual facilitation situation. So I think those are all great strategies. And I have a few other strategies I'd like to share with you based on some of the research that I've done. So let's take a look at those. And some of these we really have already talked about. We've talked about boundaries quite a bit already. Some of you have actually talked also about your role in relationships and particularly your role with the patient you're working with and adjusting to that virtual environment and how your role changes with the patients that you're working with. So I think understanding that is really, really key. And I have found I really need to understand my relationships with my colleagues, because there are people who I was working with in person in classroom scenarios in the past who I am not anymore. And I need those continued relationships. So making sure I'm maintaining those relationships, reaching out to those people, having conversations with them, seeing them in person when I can. That's been really, really important. We've talked about protecting your attention already and really making sure that distractions are as limited as possible. We'll talk about that more in a moment when we talk about your physical space. I think the last two here are kind of interesting. Understanding both the limitations and advantages of virtual work, I think, is important in preparing yourself mentally. You all have already outlined what some of the limitations are in working with patients virtually or by video. But certainly there are some advantages to working virtually, perhaps the ability to see a patient more quickly than you might be able to see them otherwise. For me, one of the advantages, and this is kind of outside of your realm, but for me, one of the advantages has been expanding the numbers and the diversity of people who I'm able to work with. Before COVID, in my practice, I had some international folks. I was going internationally a few times a year to do facilitation and training, but obviously that's costly with travel costs and housing and food and all that. Well, because of COVID, my international work has literally quadrupled because I am now able to do the international work in a much more cost-effective and time-effective manner. And I'm able to work internationally with audiences who are spread all over the place. You know, before I might go to Germany and I had a German audience. I might go to Mexico and have a Mexican audience. I literally did a workshop the other day, facilitated a class where I had people all the way from Ireland to Saudi Arabia. I think I had 8 different countries. There were 12 people in the virtual room and I had 8 different countries. Wow, that's a huge advantage to the work that I do and working virtually. So they're both limitations and advantages, and mentally you really need to understand those. And then being agile and flexible. And when we talked a little bit earlier, some of you mentioned some of the challenges that you face. Agility and flexibility is so important. And if you are not prepared for things to go wrong, you need to prepare yourself mentally for things to go wrong, because if you are not prepared, and inevitably they will at some point, boy, can things fall apart fast. And the whole scenario can fall apart fast, whether you're seeing a patient, whether you are running a meeting, whatever the scenario is, it can just fall apart so fast. And so having a backup plan and being prepared, mentally preparing yourself for things to go wrong, that's really, really critical. So those are a few ideas around things you can do to prepare yourself mentally. And those of you who shared some of your ideas, thank you so much, because particularly in working with patients, huge to be prepared mentally. So let's move on and let's talk a little bit about physical environment. Now, some of you may be working from office space and seeing patients virtually. Some of you actually may be working from home, seeing patients virtually from home, or attending or facilitating meetings from home. And so the question is really about, how do I prepare and use appropriate space? And particularly early on in the pandemic, back in the spring of 2020, when people were kind of flying by the seat of their pants and they weren't really used to this yet, we were seeing people make a lot of mistakes in terms of how they were setting up and using their space. So I would recommend, you probably do not want to do things that look like this. And yes, the view out the window over the ironing board is absolutely beautiful, but I don't think that is going to be very productive or be very comfortable as a workspace. And I have had several clients who have tried to use their dining room as their workspace. For whatever reason, I had a client whose children were home for a year because they were going to school virtually. And she tried to use her dining room as a workspace because she also was trying to keep track of her kids at the same time. And her husband, when he was working virtually, same thing. And the problem was the dining room just didn't work. There were constant interruptions, and the kids were running in and out, and it just was not appropriate for a virtual workspace. So I want to suggest to you that as much as you possibly can, you really need to have a workspace that is comfortable, but also a workspace that is private and works for what other kind of virtual work that you're doing. And so better choices might be something that looks like this. If you possibly can have workspace that is private, you're going to be much, much better off. I'm fortunate enough to have a door I can close. But certainly workspace that is comfortable. Sitting on a stool in front of an ironing board is going to be killing your back within an hour. So having workspace that's comfortable, and having workspace that is private as much as possible, and having workspace that's really designed for work as much as possible. So these are much better looking alternatives. And so a few ideas around that, and I've gotten a lot of these from my clients who have shared ideas with me, but a few ideas around preparing and using appropriate workspace. If you can possibly get away from daily activity and be in a quiet space, what a difference it makes. The person working, I mentioned working in the dining room, people were running in and out. It just wasn't working. And so if you can possibly find that quiet space, really, really important. This may sound kind of ironic, but also selecting a space where your things won't be moved around. And I had a client who had a real disaster around this. He was trying to work from a kitchen table. And he had one end of the kitchen table all set up and had all of his papers in piles and had everything all set up the way he needed it and wanted it. And one day he went out, and while he was gone, his partner decided the kitchen needed a good cleaning and really needed to be straightened up. And some of the papers to his partner didn't look important. And so into the trash they went. And some important patient notes and some important documents, because they were handwritten, they didn't look important, into the trash they went. And what a mess he had. So that's part of discussing the boundaries with the people who live with you. If your workspace is not private, and if other people are going to be in your workspace and potentially moving around in your workspace, you really need to have those boundaries. You really need to have that discussion with the people who live with you. And once again, comfort is really important. If you're going to be in front of that computer screen 5, 6, 8 hours a day or more, comfort is really important. One of the first things I did when I started working primarily virtually was to get a new desk chair, because my back was absolutely killing me. And several of my clients, at their own expense, have invested in the desks that move up and down, so you can have both a standing desk and a sitting desk. They've done it at their own expense, but they just felt it was so much more comfortable if they had the choice between standing and sitting, and they felt like they were more energized if they could stand for part of the time. And so made that investment and are very happy they've made that investment. But comfortable workspace, really important, especially when we're spending so much more time virtually than we did in the past. So let's move on and let's talk a little bit about burnout, because burnout is a big issue for a lot of us as we face this virtual environment, as we work in this virtual environment. And first of all, I'd like to just share what I consider to be some of the biggest signs of burnout. I call them the trifecta, and you can see them for yourself. I think exhaustion is a very, very common one. And I find that a lot of my clients, when they start to get burned out, not only do they get kind of negative, but they also start to develop this mental distance from their work. They kind of get disengaged from their work. They get mentally reduced from their work, or mentally removed from their work. And I think that is a big sign of burnout. And certainly if you're not as effective as you would like to be, and you feel like you're not as effective as you have been in the past, that also is a big, big sign of burnout. And I would bet everyone on this call has felt that to an extent over the last 18 months. I know I've felt all of these things over the last 18 months. And so the question becomes, how the heck do I manage burnout? And so let's talk about that a little bit. I've written, how do I avoid/manage burnout? I really think it is more manage than avoid. I think it hits all of us sooner or later. But I'd like to get your ideas again, because I'm sure this is something that everyone has faced. And I'd like to find out, what are some of your strategies? How do you manage burnout? How do you keep from feeling exhausted and becoming highly negative and feeling your productivity reduced? What are some of those strategies that you do to use to manage burnout? So if you could, please, again, go to the chat box, type in your ideas. What are some of those strategies that you've used? And while you're typing, I've already shared one of my strategies with you, and that is I take a break every hour. I actually set my timer and I take a break every hour. I try for between a 5 and 10 minute break every hour. And I may not do anything very exciting. I may just get up and walk downstairs and look out the window, or run out to the mailbox and check the mail. I don't do anything very exciting. Maybe go get a glass of water. But I find that that really, really helps reduce my level of burnout, just because I get out of my office environment for a few minutes. I get away from the computer screen for a few minutes, because that can be exhausting. And I just find that I do stay fresher. I think I'm a lot more productive if I do make myself take those regular breaks. And I definitely feel less fatigued. If I don't get up and get away from the computer periodically, I definitely am more fatigued. So that is one strategy that I've used that has really helped me better manage burnout. And we're getting some ideas from all of you. So let's take a look at what some of the things you're doing. And Amanda, I absolutely love this because I had to do the same thing. She said, I had to come to Jesus talk with my partner about what's important to us and our time, delegate tasks when possible, take at least one long weekend per quarter. I like that a lot. That is not something I've done. And that is a great idea. Just take like a 4-day weekend and get away completely. I love that. And you hired a house cleaner. Great idea. If you're in the house all the time and you're working from the house and you can get a house cleaner, I think that's a great strategy. Molly said, I struggle with feeling like I've done anything when working remotely since I'm so used to working in person clinical work. Sometimes even just making a to-do list and crossing off can remind me what I've accomplished that day. That also is a great strategy. Just that physical activity of crossing things off the list, I think is a really, really good strategy. And I cheat. I also use to-do lists, and I have to confess to you that I cheat because ideally I would prioritize and whatever is most important would get done first. But the way I cheat is that I try to do the quick hits first. And if there's something I know I can accomplish in 5 or 10 minutes and I know I'll get it done and I'll feel satisfied, I do it first, even if it's not the most important. And just having that satisfaction really, really helps. And Jen says she also gets away from the computer screen for at least 10 minutes. I think that's a huge one for all of us. And this is good. Get into nature at least one time a week. And I think that's really critical because we are spending so much time inside these days. So thanks for sharing those. I think those are great ideas around avoiding burnout. I have a few additional ones I'd like to share with you. So let's take a look at those. And several of these we've already talked about, but let's talk about the end of day ritual. And I think someone mentioned an end of day ritual earlier where they close the door to their office at the end of the day. And that is my end of day ritual because it's so easy to go downstairs, have dinner, whatever, and then 9 or 10 o'clock at night, come back upstairs. Oh, I should check my email. I should do this. I should do that. I should make my list for tomorrow. And my ritual is I close the door when I'm done at the end of the day, and that's it. I don't go back into my office until the following morning. And that ritual just really, really helps me manage my burnout. Let's see. Oh, there was one here that was really interesting, and this also came from some of the research I did. There's research that says that more people are working sick when they are working virtually than would be working when they are sick if they were back in their office or in their clinical environment. And I guess the idea is that if you're sick, you don't go to work, you don't go to the office, you don't go to the clinic, you don't go to the hospital because you don't want to expose others. And a lot of people are feeling guilty about not working if they're sick at home because I'm home alone. And so what if I have 101-degree fever? I can still get in front of my computer. And that's not a good strategy, not a good strategy at all. And so if you don't feel well, really should take the time off and not work if you're sick. And again, taking time off, as several of you have mentioned, is really important. And we mentioned earlier about using phone and doing some meetings with just audio rather than the video. And that helps manage burnout to an extent because you're not worrying about how you look and you're not worrying about that little postage stamp and what people think about how you look. So interesting strategy to turn off the camera. So we covered a lot of these, but those are a couple of others that I have found in the research that I've been doing. So let's move towards the kind of logistics part of this, and that is, how do I maximize technology and how do I manage my technology? So take a look at these for just a moment. And I think a lot of these are very, very common sense, but I have observed so many really, really smart people do so many stupid things. I think one of the things I learned early on was the importance of familiarizing myself with the virtual platform that I use primarily. And for me, it happens to be Zoom. And I've worked very hard to become relatively adept with Zoom, and I think I am, especially compared to where I was 18 months ago. Now, I recently moderated something for a client, and they used a different platform. And I thought, oh, it'll be just like Zoom, it'll be fine. Features have got to be the same. And boy, I learned very quickly, every virtual platform has its own little intricacies. And one of the things I could not do was to get my slides to show on the platform they were using. And we lost probably 5 or 6 minutes just kind of messing around trying to get my slides to show. And shame on me for not checking that platform out ahead of time, making sure that I understood it. The hardwire connection is a big deal, especially if you have other people in your home space who are working remotely. And especially back when a lot of us had kids who were going to school virtually. And so we had 2, 3, 4 people in our homes who were trying to work remotely on Wi-Fi, and it just didn't work. The Wi-Fi became overloaded. So it's a good idea to have a hardwire connection. You're a lot less likely to have connectivity issues, interruptions. It's just a really good idea to have a hardwire connection. Electronic distractions like texting, instant messaging. Communication challenges. We already talked about some of the challenges around the camera, but another virtual challenge, and this is kind of technology related, is that particularly with patients, I think it's very important to speak more slowly and to enunciate more clearly than you might do in person. I happen to be a very fast talker, and this has been a hard one for me as a facilitator and as a consultant, because I've had to force myself to speak a little bit more slowly than I naturally would. And I've really had to force myself to enunciate more clearly, because I want the people who are in a class that I'm facilitating or in a meeting that I'm holding to be able to understand me. And to do that, I just need to speak more slowly and enunciate more clearly than I would in person. And that's just one of the challenges around technology. And once again, we talked earlier about being agile and about being flexible. Got to be patient with the technology issues. They are inevitable. Just got to be flexible enough to go with the flow when something happens, because sooner or later, something always does. And finally, to wrap up before we go into the Q&A, a lot of us are going back into office or clinical settings where we may not have been for a while. So we may be transitioning to a hybrid environment, or even going back to 100% office or clinical environment. And that sounds so easy. You know, I used to work in an office full time. Well, big deal. I'm just going back to where I was. But we have changed in the last 18 months. And the way we work has changed. And the way we work with our colleagues has changed. The way we work with our patients has changed to an extent. And so this transition is a lot harder than you might think it would be. I have client companies right now that are actually holding return to office events with their employees, because they're realizing this is a big deal and big transition for people to come back either hybrid or 100%. So I think everything here makes sense. Certainly ask questions, share your concerns. A couple of the organizations I'm working with have been doing virtual open houses or virtual town meetings to allow people to ask their questions and share their concerns. So that's a big deal. If you have concerns and there's someone who you trust, who you can have a conversation with about that, that's really important. And I think everything else here is pretty self-explanatory. The only other one I would want to mention is the very last bullet down on the bottom where it says, be prepared for the challenges of hybrid meetings, because a lot of us are going to be in meetings or facilitating meetings where we have people around the table, but we also have people calling in on a phone bridge, or we have people who are attending virtually. And when you have people around the table, it's awfully easy to forget about the people on the phone bridge or about the virtual attendees. And it's absolutely critical to be sure you're including everyone. So meeting facilitation becomes a lot more challenging. But bottom line, with this transition where you're going to do a hybrid, where you're in office or in the clinic part of the time and home part of the time, or whether you're going to be 100% back in your workplace, just be aware it's not as easy as it sounds, and just be prepared for some of those issues around the transition. So we've covered a lot of territory today, and Dr. Cromer is back with us. And so what I'd like to do is open up to some questions. We have a few minutes for Q&A, and I'd love to know what questions you have about anything we've talked about today, or even not anything that I haven't covered today. So what questions do you have? Feel free to either put them in the chat box or unmute.
Maybe give a second for people to think of questions and put them in the chat box. But maybe one to get us started is that as I've been returning to more of a hybrid, both in person and at home workspace, I've found that in the new Zoom environment, there's a lot less protection of kind of clinical work from other work. Like, it's entirely possible I would have a clinical day after which no one would have scheduled a meeting, but now I have a clinical day that's followed by Zoom meetings or preceded by Zoom meetings. And I'm finding myself with the problem that the workspace that I need for virtual administration and research is different than the workspace that I need for clinical care. And so I've, trying to navigate the fact that those are no longer blocked apart has been really difficult. I was wondering if you had any recommendations for those.
Ooh, that's an interesting one, Dr. Cromer. I think that the biggest thing is to, well, I think organization is a big part of it, because I think that when those kind of things get combined again, that if you don't have things well organized, that really can become a problem. But so I guess I want to dig into this a bit more. I'm not sure I totally, I want to make sure I totally understood the question. Are these in your workplace or is this in your home? Where is this?
Well, that's the problem, is that it's a little bit of both. There was once a time where I could, do clinic and clinic, and I could do non-clinical work in a different space. And now, because we're so, facilely moving in and out of Zoom all of our day, people have started combining the two.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the guardrails become really important in that scenario. And because the thing with Zoom is, I've come to like Zoom. I've become fairly proficient with it. But the thing with Zoom is that I have found people take advantage of that access. And if you don't establish some guardrails, my gosh, it can be 24/7. So I think the guardrails are really important.
Great, thank you. And Liz asked a question in the Q&A, which is a great question, about how do we convince our work organizations to continue to trust us to work from home and to be efficient with our time? How do we change the old mindset that if you're home, you're less productive?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And thank you for asking that, because there are some more traditional organizations that are just so eager to get people back into the workplace because they don't quite trust that they were as productive at home as they could have been. So I think one thing that's really important is to be able to show that you have been able to maintain or even increase your level of productivity. And so any kind of comparison that you can do that shows level of productivity before you were virtual versus your productivity now, I think is really important. And I think also having a really frank discussion about what some of the advantages are that you have found in working virtually, and how those advantages have really helped you be more productive and address the big picture. It's all across the board. One of my clients is another major association that shall remain nameless, but they are located in downtown DC. They have about 1,000 employees. And they have decided they're going to downsize their office space. They're going to drastically reduce their office space. And they actually recently went out to their employees and did a survey and asked them about their preference for working virtually versus working in the office. And they were flabbergasted because 80% of their employees came back and said they really preferred working virtually. And they thought a much larger percentage would want to come back. So it's a challenging conversation with an employer who feels like, if I can't see you, you're not working. I think that's much less prevalent than it was before COVID.
Yeah. And while we're waiting for more questions, there have been some very interesting articles about that in the lay press, and about how the business world is feeling pressure to move towards more flexible work schedules for their employees, because that's what employees want. There's also some interesting literature about employees, basically how it feels to not be trusted to work from home. And it's like almost a form of humiliation that makes an employee very unhappy with their employer. So Liz, that's a great question, and something that I think a lot of us are struggling with at various institutions.
Sure is. Another question that frequently, do we have any other questions?
I did not see any, no.
So another question that frequently comes up that I'll just raise because it may be on the minds of folks is, and I think it relates to what we we're just talking about. My employer wants me to come back, but I'm not ready. I don't feel comfortable yet. And I've had a couple of clients recently who have approached me with that. They're telling me they want me back full time, or they want me back 3 days a week. And boy, this COVID thing is not over yet. And I don't know whether the other people in my office have been vaccinated. And how do I handle that? And I think that's a really fair question. And I think that having a really honest conversation is a very, very important part of that. Because boy, if you're not comfortable, and I guess part of it is having an honest conversation with your employer. And I think the other part is also trying it out, seeing how it goes. And if you get there and you do not feel comfortable, then it's time for a really, really blunt conversation with your employer. But once again, a lot of the employers that my clients are working with have been pretty sympathetic to that, and they've been doing a good job of communicating what the safety protocols are and what they're doing to try to keep people safe when they're back in the workplace. But I know a lot of people have those concerns.
Yeah. Well, great. Thank you so much, Mr. Deepak. And then we are about to conclude our session. We would like to give great thanks for that wonderful talk. We'd also like to thank the Leona M and Harry B. Helmsley Charitable Trust again for their support of today's program and the Focus on Fellows program in general. I also wanted to thank each of you for joining our 9th annual Focus on Fellows. And we're concluding our session today, but we will be hosting additional sessions this fall, which you can see in the slide that's currently posted. They include discussions of the standard of care in diabetes updates, also discussions on interviews, negotiating, and how to network with authenticity. And then, of course, in June, there's the scientific sessions coming up. So, get excited now, and we hope to see you there. So thank you all again for your time, and we look forward to connecting with you at the next Focus on Fellows event.